Welcome to a very special edition of Talk Hockey Radio in collaboration with the Hockey Museum. Today we bring you a 70th anniversary special of the Wembley Games that were played between 1951 and 1991.
So my name is Kate Richardson-Walsh and I played for England and Great Britain from 1999 to 2016, and I was part of the history-making team that won gold in Rio, and I have 375 international caps.
Hello, my name's Anita White. I played for England between 1971 and 1976 and was privileged to captain the England team when we won the World Cup in 1975. I appeared at Wembley, I think it's 5 times, and Maggie was in fact part of the team that played from 74 onwards. So we played together for several games.
Hi, my name is Maggie Souyave. I played for England and GB between 74 and 87. Played 11 times at Wembley, captained at the Royal Wembley in 81, and I have a total of 103 caps.
Hi, I'm Christabel Russell Vick, and I'm one of the co-authors of the Hockey Museum's Magic of Wembley.
Well, thanks for joining us today for this very special edition of Talk Hockey Radio. I'm so in awe of all of you, really, to be honest with you. Hopefully, we'll have a really good discussion of the Wembley era and your experiences of playing there, and also, maybe get a bit of a contrast from Kate, well, on what it was like for you playing now, as opposed to back then when they played at Wembley, really. So let's go on with the first question, shall we? So the first one, I'd like to go, talk about the book a little bit before we go on to the actual, playing era games and stuff. So Christabel, or Chris, as you like to be called, tell us how you got involved in creating the book and its conception and publication.
Well, I decided to volunteer for the Hockey Museum, but at the first meeting I went to, they said, "Oh, we've got a project for you because Nan Williams has researched women's hockey at Wembley, and we'd like you to turn it into a book. And we're giving you a deadline of the Women's World Hockey Cup, and therefore you've got 18 months to put it together." Nan had done all the research, so it was really a question of me sourcing photographs and perhaps sorting the layout. And my idea was that it would be a book where people could enjoy a trip down memory lane with all the memorabilia that we remember. I went to the hockey a lot. My first trip was in 1965 when I was about 9, and I went about 20 times. So it's very much part of my childhood. And, it was the fun of the girls having a day out rather than the boys. And a friend of mine came with me one time, and she said, "I'm so pleased to be going to Wembley because my brother always goes to the boys football international, and now I get a chance to go for the girls." So it was quite nice. So I was able to add a little bit to the book about my experiences of it. And it was a lot of fun to do, really. I got Nan to help me with various things, and there was initially, I think, the intent of having a more serious book, but I think my view was, no, let's just celebrate it, enjoy it, and have the fun of remembering what the day out at Wembley once a year was.
Brilliant. Well, was there any hidden gems that you basically found whilst you were either doing your own research or what Nan had put together?
Well, I had a lot of fun going through the Hockey Museum's photographs to find photographs for things that I had in my memory, like all the schoolgirls and people wearing different rosettes, the pop stars of the day. It was anything to make money. So it wasn't all about England. It was about sort of what was going on socially at the time. Probably the biggest bombshell for me was when I was interviewing my mother, because I decided to write a book about my family history. And she told me that it was actually my grandfather that organised for the women to go to Wembley. And I couldn't believe it. And she said that he'd gone to the match in 1949 at the Oval, and they had 10,000, and the still wasn't big enough. And my grandfather, Sir Godfrey Russell Vick, said to the then president, "This is ridiculous. The women should be playing at Wembley." And the president, Helen Armfield, said, "Well, we tried, but they won't have us." And he said, "Well, that's ridiculous. I shall ring Sir Arthur Elvin on Monday and tell him he's got to." And that's what he did. And that's why the women went in 1951. And I was amazed, because that was kind of the first time I'd heard that he was the one that sort of enabled it to happen.
Yeah, well, so you must have a lot of stories to tell about, you know, your experiences or your mother's experiences, you know, getting involved and making it happen. I mean, it obviously only took about a year from actually being mentioned at the Oval to it.
No, it was 2 years, because it was 1949.
Oh, sorry, apologies. So,
and they were told that they had to guarantee a crowd of 20,000. So that was actually quite hard work. But luckily, Marjorie Pollard was running Hockeyfield, and she did a lot of advertising, and somebody had the wit to contact British Rail and get special trains to run into Wembley Central. And so the sort of drive was on to get all schools and clubs to agree to come. And a lot of people came from, you know, further afield. And, you know, we have actually got some examples of, you know, people coming from, like, up in Cumbria and leaving the very early hours of the morning, coming down, enjoying the match. And then they would go to a show at the Wembley Empire Pool, and then get the train back and arrive back very late at night. So it was a full day out.
It's for me, it's pretty mind-boggling to even get British Rail involved at that time. You know, it's pretty easier nowadays because of social media and other collaborations that, you know, British Rail or other you know, train organisations will get involved in, and they would know about it, so they would put extra trains on. But getting British Rail involved, putting on extra trains or even, you know, special trains at that time was amazing. I
thought another thing that was very interesting was things like having published song sheets by the Daily Express, and that idea of really getting the crowd whipped up. It's lovely, you know, instead of our current situation where we have hockey makers frantically trying to get Mexican waves going and so on. A publication like the Daily Express, of its weight and power, would get behind this. It's incredible.
Yeah, definitely. What lessons do you think could be learned from back then? Put something like that in place now, possibly. I don't know.
I don't think you can repeat this. It was an absolute one-off of its time, and there wasn't any other women's sport that was doing anything like this. And women's sport as a whole simply didn't have the recognition that it has now. You know, there've been enormous strides in the last 10 years, I would say. But this was amazing.
Yeah.
That, you know, to think in the 50s, 60s, 70s, when women's sport was just not taken any account of, that they could get this fantastic, well, first of all, play at the National Stadium. And we've heard the story of how that happened. But then all of the schools sending these school parties by coach, by train, to come to it every year.
Yeah.
And you know, that whole idea of playing in front of 68,000, which was the crowd when Maggie and I were playing, it was surreal. It was. So I don't think you can quite repeat it. And I'd like to think that you know, women's sport gets loads more recognition. And Kate, your team, since you won the gold medal in Rio, it's been fantastic, the attention that hockey's got, and people have seen it on TV. But I don't think you'll ever recapture the Wembley thing, which was just something very unique in its time.
Because if you look at the 1951 footage, which there's some of, and you see the school children, not only were the school children there, but they were in their school uniform. Nearly everyone, if we're thinking of the thousands of children, they all just met, and today that just wouldn't happen, but it had something special about it, being, you know, from all over the country, and all these school children in even their school caps or school hats, you know, so it was absolutely special in terms of just seeing the actual massive crowd as well. It was fantastic. And I agree with Anita, you won't be able to replicate that in the modern day, but it's in a way you wouldn't want to, because that had its special moment in the years during the period it was going on.
Oh, well, yeah, you're probably right. Well, you are right. I'm not going to argue with you. But yeah, this brings us nicely onto, you know, obviously yourselves playing Maggie and Anita. We'll come to the selection part to start off with. Obviously, you know, you played before Wembley happened, and then obviously as Wembley happened and things like that. What was it like to, you know, get the letter and also know that you were selected for England, and then knowing that you'll be playing at Wembley?
Well, I'll try and answer, and Maggie, you can
Yes,
chip
I'll
in.
jump in as
Yeah,
well.
of course. Yeah, absolutely.
It was an interesting kind of method at that time. Everybody at the beginning of the hockey season, everyone started from square one. So you went from your club to county trials. So that was the first step. Could you make it into county? Right. Then the county teams played each other at a tournament that was over the new year. And from that, they chose what was called a territorial team. There were 5 regions: North, South, East, West, and Midlands. Then during January and February, the worst time of the year, those teams played against each other in front of a panel of England selectors. And at the end of that, they announced the England team. And you got a letter saying you've been chosen to play such and such a position for England, because everyone was chosen by position. 11 positions were named. And these are the fixtures, and can you please report for the first game such and such. We did have one day or weekend of practice before we played together as a national team. And I think we see in Christabel's excellent book how, you know, coaches were only really introduced during the late 60s and 70s.
And Maggie, how does that selection process compare to now in terms of a notification to players? I imagine it's maybe slightly quicker than a letter in the post, maybe.
I know that I certainly, and I'm not sure if Anita remembers this, but I certainly remember sometimes going for the Sunday newspaper and looking for the team spot. And you were very nervously with your family looking, and not necessarily on the back page, but you'd have to look further into the pages to find the team. So sometimes the team wasn't chosen immediately after the territorials, they would take time. So I recall that before you get your actual letter, that to have to go and read it in the Sunday newspaper, and then you'd come waving back, you know, if you were, as Anita said, in the first 11. So for me, in my position as a right winger, it was important to be the best winger I could be in the country. So unlike today, where you have obviously got a squad of players now. But I also remember being in my final year at college when I was first selected for the senior team, and again at the time it was all your hopes and dreams had come true, and it was something that I was able to then share with my family and friends and my college teammates who were all buzzing on the day. So it's a fantastic feeling, of course, and something you will always treasure at the very first moment. And one thing to remember, at college, I was one of my lecturers was Maureen Short, and she was a past England player, and she at the time was obviously absolutely thrilled in terms of the selection, and offered to buy my first England tracksuit. So that is certainly a special memory that I do have, and you know, I'll always remember that.
Wow. So basically you found out about being selected before you even got the letter?
Yes.
Wow.
Those are the occasions I remember. I don't think it happened, say, I think from 51 through obviously to 91, I'm sure there were many different processes. but certainly in my years, in terms of the early part of selection in the 70s, I recall definitely going for that Sunday newspaper and having to decide whether it was the Times, the Telegraph, and in fact, I have to say I probably bought all the papers so that you could then read the cuttings of the territorial tournament. So it led from that as well.
Oh, brilliant! So basically, the letter was just a confirmation, really.
Absolutely.
So you already knew. Wow, that's amazing. I mean.
And the one thing I don't know whether Anita feels the same, that when you were first selected, the one thing you did know that you had the opportunity to play at the iconic Wembley Stadium, because in the early days we had home countries matches, so you certainly knew you would have the 3 home countries matches, and then if it was possible, you would always get the opportunity to have foreign teams at Wembley. And I noticed, Chris, that there was at least 50% of the 41 matches, 50% were played at Wembley. Well, 20 were played at Wembley, weren't they? And the other one was obviously at White City. So that was exciting too, to know that it was that you would be playing Holland, Germany, Australia, New Zealand, America. So that was really very special. And I always think back to my brothers, my footballing brothers. They were all very jealous to know that you'd be off down, not just watching at Wembley but playing.
Oh wow! Can imagine.
It was a definite policy that every other year they had a home country there.
Oh right, okay. Wow. Yeah, I mean, looking at the stats, obviously Wales, Ireland and Scotland played more hockey at Wembley than any other nations anyway. So, you mentioned, Maggie, about your, college teacher basically buying your first England tracksuit for you. So this basically brings us nicely onto my next question, is the fact that you had the uniform changed, or the kit changed from 51 to 91 or whatever, vastly. What was it like, for you having the kit? Obviously, at that time you had to buy your own kit or whatever. What was it like putting your kit up, and what, talk us through that experience?
Well, for me, was very interesting, really, because I look back at 51 and they wore pinafores. So the one thing that when we were selected, that it was good to know that we wouldn't be wearing pinafores when we played. But what we did know, we would be playing with long sleeve white shirts. So they still had that iconic long sleeve white shirt. Much thicker material though than the modern day, and we would have, again in my day, it was the Len Smith's skirt, so the cardinal red skirt. Then of course you had your socks. In a funny way, I do believe in the past that they also did provide you with red knickers, but I don't think that's something that we tended to dive into when we were going to get our kit. And quite often you did hire or buy your kit. Some of the kit you were allowed to buy. The interesting thing is we were measured up for the kit, for the shirts, the skirts, the blazer, but quite often when you did actually get it, it wasn't necessarily, it didn't necessarily always fit in a flattering way, let's say. So I think the advancements in technology and clothing, and the clothing now is obviously much better. So from a point of view of playing, it obviously was much thicker and heavier. And we just got on with it. That's all we knew, really, if I had to say on that respect.
And Maggie, do you remember with the skirts, when we had to kneel down and have them measured from the bottom of the hem to the where you were kneeling on the ground, to make sure that they were sufficiently decorous, so you weren't showing too much bum?
I know, quite
That's
different.
the opposite.
Yeah,
it's the opposite.
Yes.
The shorter the better, it seems. I would have liked that.
Yeah, well, you just look at the tennis players now too. So there was some concern, and this is why we had to have matching red cardinal knickers, so that if we did fall over and the television camera zoomed in, it would be not too embarrassing.
On the shirt, I can remember when I started playing, I was in the old sort of quarter style rugby shirt, and obviously it's completely inflexible. Trying to push the ball, hit the ball was a nightmare. I was just looking through the photos, and it looks like you weren't able to roll your sleeves up. Were you required?
No,
you had them buttoned at the cuff, and you just had to. You tended to probably have a slightly bigger shirt in order to be able to perform all the actions. So you're quite right about that.
But we weren't aware of it being constricting. As Maggie said, you just get on with it. That was the uniform, and it was with great pride that you wore the England cardinal red. The other thing we haven't mentioned is we all had white blazers then, and so when we walked out onto the pitch at the beginning of the game to be presented, we were all wearing white blazers with 3 red roses on the on the breast pocket.
Yeah. And those, do you remember as well? I don't know whether you went by train, Anita, but when you got on the train, you didn't. You had your bag and your hockey stick. In fact, I don't think we had hockey stick bags then. And we just carried one stick, took your bag, but we also held our blazers, so we had them on hangers and then hung them up on the train. Distinctly remembering that. So it's so very different to today.
Yeah.
Oh wow, that's quite amazing, isn't it? Really. So you're saying that the uniform, even though it was maybe a little bit oversized or whatever, wasn't restrictive. Was it okay to play in, or?
Absolutely, yes. It was just something we did at county, well, even at club level at times. At county, I played for Lancashire and then went on to the north, and you had long sleeve shirts. Only till later on, maybe in the late 70s, 80s, did maybe you get a quarter sleeve shirt.
So the pinafores you were talking about, Maggie, was those, wasn't it? I believe that's Ireland that England were playing against. So Ireland were in that uniform, and obviously your iconic long sleeve tops there with the.
That's right.
And I believe, I'm not sure who that is actually, but I believe that England player actually scored the goal, even though they went down like that.
Really, that's fantastic, isn't it? I mean, that's just amazing.
Such a good picture.
It is, isn't it?
And I think the skirts in those days were they were like divided skirts. So.
Yeah. Wow.
And the pinafore, I mean, it's just, I think, if I remember rightly, it looks like the opposition had the pinafore things in there, isn't it?
Yeah.
Tights on as well. Can you imagine?
We noticed that England weren't wearing the tights. I just wondered, with you mentioning about the skirt being measured, was that for them sort of maintaining dignity that they had those on?
Yeah, I think so. I think that was the reason for the skirt being measured. That it would be too risque if you'd had it too short, like a mini skirt, for example. It wasn't meant to be like that. You had to look respectable and smart.
Yeah.
I think as the years went by, the shorter the skirt got, certainly.
Yeah.
Didn't it?
Yeah. But I think that's the experience that I noticed as well from the 1951 images to let's say even the 1991 images. The skirts did actually get shorter, but they're even shorter now, I think, like you were saying, Kate.
Well, one of the skirts that turned up as a prototype was practically see-through, and I said, I'm not wearing that. I used to wear Len Smith skirts. I wore Len Smith skirts, I think, definitely at county, and I think I remember getting. It was the really like proud thing to have a Len Smith skirt. Was the history of the game. I remember Mum like really making sure I understood this was an important skirt I was getting. So I do remember how important that those brands were and how they supported hockey and what they did for hockey.
Absolutely.
But this again brings us nicely onto the playing at Wembley section of our podcast, you were obviously the very first ever women's sport, let alone hockey, women's sport to actually play at Wembley. And looking back on it now, that's an amazing accomplishment. I mean, I think even now hockey is quite innovative and, you know, forward thinking, but back then playing at Wembley as a women's sport must have been amazing for you guys. And maybe we can reflect on that with the similarities of you playing at, you know, in the 2018 you know, World Cup, Kate. But talk us through you know, your experience of actually playing at Wembley and what it was like for you. Maggie,
well, for me, obviously the knowledge of the tradition and history behind Wembley was huge. So, you know, for me, I went to Wembley as a spectator. So I spent many years, you know, from a young age going with my school, Barnsley, to Wembley. So, of course, year after year going, you always had a dream to play for Wembley, and certainly one of mine was that very thing. And when you saw it, you in a way, it took your breath away to some extent, and the massive noise was just unbelievable. My first Wembley was against Holland in '74. Despite losing the game, I absolutely thought it was unbelievable. From the moment you sort of maybe we were going down Wembley Way, seeing the Twin Towers, seeing the sort of actual scale of the whole stadium, that is something that will always remain with me. And, you know, as I earlier said, that you had the opportunity only to play home countries matches during the period we played. So, you know, you got 3 or 4 internationals a year, and maybe every 4 years you got a tournament. And so to have the opportunity on my occasion, there were 58,000 there. So the things I remember is, very briefly, we arrived outside the door of the changing rooms. We went in, put our kit in, we walked up the tunnel to an empty stadium, had a look at the pitch, came back down the tunnel, went to have lunch. Then obviously at lunch we could go onto the balcony and look down Wembley Way and see the mass of spectators coming. So all those things are a fabulous experience. And then the actual going up the tunnel and to going to the stadium when it was full to capacity was just unbelievable. And those are the things. So what I remember is it has a special time. And I think in 2018 was very special too, but it was in a different way. You know, at the Queen Elizabeth Stadium, it was full to capacity, but it was like a cauldron, an arena there. And I think for me, it's Wembley's unique, but so is the stadium in London for very different reasons. And, you know, there's nothing better in the time we played to go. It was like a day out, and a day out that everyone remembered. So it was the annual day out. And it was obviously very sad when in '91 we had to finish playing there, but times move on. And I think it's something we won't be able to replicate again, but we wouldn't want to. So, you know, for schoolgirls, certainly watching the game, I'm sure, like me, they had many dreams to play for England. And Kate, I would imagine you certainly had that as well, you know, in terms of your career.
I mean, I came to watch some Wembley games. So I remember my mum was a PE teacher at Marple Hall, and she was taking a coach load of girls to watch. So it must have been, I don't know, it must have been mid to late 80s or something like that. And that's all I remember, the noise and just being, you know, again, I was only young, but, you know, understanding that this was an iconic sporting place in the world, never mind in our country. And to be there and to see hockey, women's team playing, and just the noise. That's all I can remember, is the noise and the flags and singing, and there's just so much joy. But I didn't even dare to. I hadn't even started playing hockey then, so I hadn't even dared to dream. But just to have experienced that and seen that, I think was really special. I'm literally in awe of you ladies. I just think it is iconic to have played in front of that many people at Wembley. Is just the most astonishing thing. I want to ask you like a million questions. That I want to know what you ate for lunch. I want to know what time did you arrive? Did you, how, the nerves built up and all of that?
Yeah,
it's been amazing.
Well, yeah, basically, just talk us through. Kind of, it's different now for you, Kate. Or it was different now for you, with the nutrition and all that stuff. So, what did you actually have for lunch or dinner or whatever pre-game or and how nervous?
You won't believe it. You won't believe this. And I don't know if it was every time, but certainly one time it was roast beef and Yorkshire pudding.
Yeah.
Wow.
I mean, can you imagine going out to play an international match on that? That was probably a very special lunch that Wembley Stadium put on. And we had it upstairs in the banqueting room where we went for tea after the game with all the VIPs and other people. Yeah. But the teams had lunch together actually up there.
And it probably was about a couple of hours before we played, rather than getting everything absolutely right as to when you would eat food and when you would digest. And so.
and then as Maggie said, it was really exciting standing up on the balcony between the two twin towers, looking down and seeing all these coachloads of schoolgirls arriving, and you begin to get really, really nervous. There was a whole ritual around we were in these big changing rooms, which were obviously the ones that were used by all the footballers. So there was an enormous communal bath in there. And before the game, the tradition was we'd often get telegrams and bouquets of flowers from our supporters. So I think you've got a picture in your book, Chris, of the two security guys from Wembley delivering the flowers to the changing room. Yeah, and then you mentioned the community singing. We could hear that in the changing room. So because we often joined in with it, just because it was a way of getting rid of some of the nerves.
Yeah.
And I'm sure Maggie had the same experience. But you waited in the tunnel in the dark with the other team. You could hear this sound outside, but as you walked out, it was like walking into a wall of sound. And the whole of the game, the crowd just kept up this noise. There was no let up. You couldn't hear the whistle.
But you couldn't hear yourself.
No, and you couldn't communicate with the other members of your team. We used to play in front of a few hundred. Yeah. So suddenly, you're in this wall of sound. You can't communicate. You can't hear the whistle. The grass was good for football, but it was pretty awful for hockey. It was far too long and far too boggy. So it was difficult to play a good game of hockey, to play well there. But it was just a fantastic occasion.
How did you suppress the nerves? Because obviously nowadays, I remember, I think, a talk through that Kate and Sam Queck and a few others did. They were talking about the nerves in the tunnel. And everyone's got their own individual plan as to how they're going to prepare for the game, and they go back a long time as to the preparation period. So they've got lots of support in how to manage the nerves. I can't imagine there was perhaps quite the same infrastructure back then. So how did you guys cope with that anticipation? And it is something when you go out and see the stadium empty, you go away, you get dressed, you get ready, you go back out, and it's rammed full.
Yeah, well, we didn't have any, sports psychologists were not known then. And I don't think, we just, we were a team, we helped each other. And when new players came into the team, the more experienced players would support them. And, we were all in it together, and it was, you just got on with it.
I think so. And I do remember, as Anita mentioned, that when you lined up in the tunnel was quite long. And then when you came out, it was even longer to actually go towards the royal box to line up. So you had plenty of time, in a way, to think about the game ahead. But to some extent, it was good because you could take it all in. And I think the crowd itself helped you, even though we couldn't hear one another, we couldn't hear the whistle. We just got on with it and enjoyed the experience. So there's many things, though, many memories in that respect. And quite rightly, Anita mentioned about the grass. From above, it looked beautiful, but a lot of it had green sawdust and far too long. Not quite the kind of pitch to play top class hockey on, but we managed. I don't know what Anita feels like, but as a right winger and you were a left winger, we were close to the sideline. And in those days, you were not allowed to interchange in the same way as you can now. And you had to sort of hug the sideline, and you had minimal, you had to ensure you took care and attention to, trap the ball so that it wasn't just flipping off the sideline. So those are the kind of things I also remember. So when you got your first touch right, and then you were able to sort of get on and control that, got rid of your nerves to some extent.
Maggie, I don't know if it happened to you. I mean, it was great when you got a good pass and you ran onto it and you're running down the wing, and the whole of the Wembley crowd was just lifting you because they were making so much noise, and they screamed louder and louder the nearer the goal you got. Absolutely. But I know at least on one occasion, and maybe more, I missed the ball when it was passed out to me, and the whole crowd groaned.
I know, yes. That's what I'm meaning, that you had to ensure you did.
It was the worst feeling, I can tell you, just to hear that.
So, you talked about the nerves going through the tunnel. It was a little bit different for you, Kate, especially at Lee Valley. The tunnel isn't that long, and the pitch isn't that far away, to be honest with you. And it's a shorter distance, and your experience at the World Cup in 2018 must have been quite similar, although probably not to that extent. But
no, I mean, watching the World Cup in 2018, there were times where I was like, oh, I wish I was still playing, but because as Maggie said, it's kind of just on. It feels like you're on top of the pitch, because when the stadium was full, it's all packed around. Yeah. It is a really nice atmosphere. I suppose probably, I mean, honestly, for me, in terms of relating in any way to what Anita and Maggie are saying, I can only think of opening ceremonies for Commonwealth Games or Olympic Games. That's the only thing I think that would at all be alike, being in the dark tunnel and walking a long way out into light and noise. And that is that's one of my most special memories. So, but then to be able to go and play the sport that you love and that you're amazing at, and for your country in front of that crowd, I can't even begin to imagine really what that was like. London 2012 was obviously special. We had really good crowds for every game, regardless of whether Great Britain were playing or not. But again, I think, I mean, Maggie probably knows better than me, but I think it was around 15,000 the capacity there. So you're talking a tiny amount really compared to what these women have played in front of at Wembley. So I mean, and that noise was loud and electric and hard. That was hard to hear one another, and we had to really talk about that. But yeah, to have that multiplied by whatever is just, it's what you see when I switch on men's football, and I see it every week, and when not in normal times, you think, wow, I would have loved to have played in front of that many people, and people that I played with. I played with Maggie, that I played with people that got to experience that, and how special is that?
I mean, you've all talked about you couldn't hear the whistle, and because of the crowd and things. It was probably even more difficult back then, because didn't the umpires actually run the sideline and not actually come on the pitch? It's a lot these days to hear the whistle. But
I think that certainly from what I can gather in reading the Wembley book, they tried many things out, I believe, in order to solve the problem of hearing the whistle. They tried a policeman's whistle, I believe, amplifier on the umpire's jacket, siren whistles, a flag. So, and then obviously decided upon a klaxon was given a go. And certainly I would say that interrupted the flow of the game in terms of what you would want to see, because quite often I believe what happened is there were two operators below the royal box, and each were assigned an umpire, and then the moment the signal came from the umpire on the pitch would whistle and signal, and then the operator had to then press the klaxon. Yeah. So that was the procedure of it. So you can imagine that would go, but you'd still be running down the pitch with the ball, or you'd be passing the ball, and then the ball would have to stop play and bring it back. So often the play was very much interrupted. I believe Fowles scored a goal on one occasion because the operator got excited with the klaxon, and there's all sorts of things. So I think there's some funny moments, I'm sure. And occasionally in the game, the ball would go in the goal, and the spectators thought it was a goal, and then the ball was outside the circle. So there were many amusing times, but the actual the umpire's whistle and the klaxon, that would all contributed to a different type of game.
Yeah, wow.
And there was also the fact that they didn't have an electronic scoreboard. They because the electronic scoreboard they had was for the greyhound racing, they had to put up a sort of manual scoreboard, and it meant that they had two men up on the balcony that when a goal was scored had to walk along the gantry to change the score. And I do remember on one occasion, you know, they got halfway along before they realised no, it wasn't a goal, so they had to walk back and sit down again.
Yeah, it was very amusing. There's a lot of amusing things, I would have to say.
Question about so something Maggie said. Kate was at these matches and saw the games, and Tess Howard has said that going to the 2018 World Cup was like the trigger point in her head when she went, oh, I'd quite like to do this. Did it occur to you when you were doing this that you were having that inspirational impact on people and making people want to dare to dream to do these sorts of things?
Well, it's an interesting question. That for me, I definitely, as a schoolgirl watching, I would look at different players on the pitch. I grew up as a sporting girl, but played football with my brothers and played cricket, and eventually had aspirations to play hockey, and then play for England, play at Wembley, captain. So I had all those aspirations. So as a player, then you hope that you would show many things on the pitch, you know, in terms of how you inspire the next generation. And one would hope, not just from the playing, but from other parts on and off the pitch, you would do that. So I hope that I contributed to that for the players of today and the future players.
Yeah, just to add to that, I don't think we ever thought about, well, I certainly didn't think about being an inspiration or a role model, but you did feel a huge responsibility. Yeah. That you were playing for your country, and therefore you wanted to give a good account of yourself and a good account of England hockey. So there was tremendous, if you like, pride and responsibility. But I don't think we were as aware then of that whole thing of inspiring youngsters and getting them into the game. Although indeed a lot of us had come from a physical education background and were PE teachers.
Yes.
So maybe that was part and parcel of our philosophy. But there weren't the sort of notion of idols or stars or anything like that in the same way. Val Robinson was the nearest to a star, because she won Superstars several times. So she was recognised, you know, outside hockey for the outstanding athlete she was. I don't know if Maggie agrees, but generally it was much more low key then.
Yeah, definitely. There's no question about that. And certainly from having idols, and you probably did look back. I tended to have players within my own county and territory that you were who you were playing with, and that is what was maybe inspiring you then to continue to then play for your country, more so than looking at the internationals themselves.
You mentioned, Maggie, about captaining the side and your aspirations while you were watching, actually obviously play for England, and also captain the side. So you actually, accomplished that as you did, Anita. So talk us through like the selection process, and how you got selected to be captain, because again, it's a really, really different nowadays to what it was like back then, even in the 50s or whatever. So how did you get selected to be a captain, and what was it like going out? And I think both of you played at Wembley before you were captains, and then you became captains, and then obviously led the team out. So just talk us through that, because that must have been a different experience for you, just being just being a player. You weren't just players, but being a player and then being the captain, leading the team out.
Well, for me, I look back at school. I captained at school. Then you played junior hockey, junior county and junior territorial hockey. You moved on to senior, but I mentioned I got chosen when I was at college, so I captained the college team. Then you played for senior county, so aspired to captain the county, same with the North Territory. So came through many stages of being a captain and being a leader in that way. So of course, as you're progressing through there, then once you had this dream to play for England, you would then want even more. And for me, I definitely did one day want to captain England and achieve that very dream. So for me, it was great pride, great pleasure, great joy. Anything that you could do to lead your country is just exciting, and it's even more exciting when you have the possibility to do it at Wembley, to lead the team out at Wembley. And for me, later on we talk about the Royal Wembley. For me to lead out the team and also present the team to the captain was just beyond my wildest dreams, really.
Yeah, I don't know, Maggie, how it was, how the selection worked when you became captain. When I became captain, I was actually named as captain at the time that the team was announced, and so it was the selectors that made the decision,
Right.
not the players.
Right.
And I think that it would have been better in a way if it had been a player's decision rather than the selectors. But that was the way it was. You weren't going to turn it down.
No, absolutely.
So again, I think perhaps what was very different in those days is there was minimal coaching. So the captain was very much involved in the tactics, and indeed we were consulted also on the selection of the team. There were a lot of responsibilities that went with it over and beyond the field of play. In those early days, we had formal dinners after the games, and you had to make a speech, an after-dinner speech. I mean, can you imagine having been through the whole excitement of playing a game at Wembley, having to stand up and make a speech at the dinner? It was really, really tough. But also the captain was automatically on the executive of the All England Women's Hockey Association. So I attended monthly meetings, and I was very much the player's voice and representative at those meetings. And I think that was quite forward-looking, actually, of the association, because it's only recently, I think, that players have really been involved in some of that decision-making. But they were doing it then. And the other liaison you had, obviously, was with the manager. So if there was a coach and a manager, you'd work closely with them about arrangements that were in place for the team. And then what we've talked about the, trying to make sure Maggie came in actually still as a college student on the right wing when I was captain, Maggie. I did my best to make you feel welcome and at home.
You did very well indeed.
So we took that was also part of your responsibility, to be aware of the different players in the teams and what their needs were, and if they had particular issues, you try and address those. And there would be times when the players were all very annoyed with the selectors or the coach, and they were, were very critical. And so you had to kind of handle that as captain. And I can see Kate nodding there, so I expect there's quite a lot that's the same.
Yeah, I mean, really similar. But I was voted in as captain in 2003 by the players, so as you say, really different. But similar probably to both of you in that was captain of the school team and then county and territory and through the juniors. So I don't know. I don't think I ever really thought I want to be captain, but I know when it came, it was one of the most proudest moments to be captain of your country. And for me, to know the legacy of that position, to know the women that have gone before me, that I'm joining that list of incredible women, I think that felt very special to me. I took that very seriously, my whole captaincy. And exactly as Anita and Maggie have said, you whether you're a captain or you're playing, you wear that shirt with pride, and you are representing your country and hockey and the team and the players that haven't been selected. So there is that sense of pride anyway, just wrapped up in being presented with that shirt and being honoured to wear it. But I think walking the team out for any game, I think, is very special.
Absolutely. I think the difference also in the past, because we didn't get together very often, maybe sometimes it was you got together on a Thursday evening, you had a 2-hour practice on the Friday, and then you played an international hockey match. So when the team was first selected, I think the players wouldn't have necessarily known, who to vote for in that way. So possibly that it's something that grew, and maybe they took knowledge from the different territories as to what roles they had and played within their own territories. So I think it was very different to now, because I think there's much more time now. The players are together, they can bond with each other, they can make decisions, and therefore a voting system sometimes is how it moved towards, really.
Cool.
Maggie, did you, when you were coach, did you pick the captain? I can't remember.
In the early part, and then we moved eventually, yes. So through my time, 95 to 99, the captain, and then I think it moved maybe after the Olympics, when it leaded on 2000 onwards, is when then they started to do the voting. Yeah, and it's all relevant, isn't it? It became professional in terms of the players, and much more professional in terms of the coach, the assistant coaches, managers, much more support to the team as well. So you had a much bigger support team to the individuals.
Cool. Maggie, you mentioned the Royal Game.
Oh, that's such a good picture.
Look, you see, I can't take my eyes off her. Can you imagine how you feel when you are thinking what I was going to say to her when I presented with the bouquet? It's an amazing picture, actually, I'd have to say.
That's a lovely picture, and very quite sharp as well, isn't it? I mean, you can see obviously the players, yourself and the Queen, and found behind you as well.
In fact, that moment, the Queen had been at the other side with the Welsh team, and then she came across. And the one thing I don't know whether it comes through in that photograph, that I had a line of we had the umpire and then the line of the team. Yeah. And I had to say to myself, whatever you do not forget anyone's name as you go along that line. I'll tell you now, it always sticks in my mind, this. And as you can say, I had to try and think, now stop looking at the Queen, concentrate on who you're introducing. Honestly, it was the relief when I got to the end. Then when I got to the end, of course, Vicky Dixon was there with the bouquet of flowers to give to me to present to the Queen. And I'm thinking, it was just such relief. And then we did have a conversation, and I recall it distinctly. It was about the turf. And I'm thinking, yes, the grass is green, or yes, it is long. I have no idea quite what I said, but we did talk about the actual hallowed turf itself. because everybody does say to this day, what did you talk about? I said, well, that's what we did talk about, you know, how long the grass was, how green it was, and oh dear. But no, it was a very special moment.
Chris,
I forgot. Sorry, I was going to say I've done exactly what Maggie said happened to me in South Africa. I was going down the players, introducing them. I think it was a South African dignitary. I can't remember. And I got halfway down, and I had my brain froze, and all I could think about was this player's nickname. And I was like, oh no, I'm just gonna have to go with it. And I just had to then just carry on in that vein. It was just awful because you are, you know, this is quite a special moment. But the Queen, that's like another level.
You've done that quite a few times though, haven't you, with dignitaries, haven't you, Kate?
Well, she's well used to it now.
I'm all right now.
Yeah. It got better as you got more experienced.
I had a question actually. Was it difficult not to be, as a player, totally in awe? I mean, like in my time, I remember when Edwin van der Sar would rock up to watch at the Euro hockey and at Bowden, and obviously the players were kind of in awe of him. But with no disrespect intended to Edwin, he's not quite on the same level as the Queen. How do you guys deal with that? You know, the nerves and thinking I'm going to meet the Queen. That's just a ridiculous sentence to say out loud.
Well, I suppose you have to just hold your emotions, and in a way, the most important thing was to make sure you didn't let the day go by too quickly. And what was quite good about the day the Queen came is that we went out quite early to line up in front of the royal box, and although you could think, well, you'll be even more nervous, it gave us time to think about what was going to happen. And the Queen came in her royal Range Rover and took quite a bit of time to come around the stadium to actually then come in front of the royal box and get out of the with the two presidents. Apparently that wasn't supposed to be, but it happened, didn't it, Chris, I believe? And she obviously, it's those moments where you just have to compose yourself and do your job, I suppose.
The funny thing about the Queen appearing at Wembley was that they had invited her every year for years. And there was an executive meeting, and my mother said, I haven't had the usual refusal from the Queen. I'm a bit worried she's going to accept. And everybody laughed. and then she did indeed accept, and that actually brought in a whole raft of other things that needed to happen. For instance, she couldn't stay for tea after the match, so then they had to organise a lunch before the game, and they had to draw up menus. Wembley were not amused because they had to repaint the banqueting hall, so you know it was a big deal for everybody.
Wow.
And yes, when the Queen was going round in the Range Rover, she basically said, I'm not going on my own. So my mother and the Welsh president had to go in with her and go round. I mean, experience of a lifetime.
Yeah, I read that in the book as well. That you know, like you were saying, Chris. Basically, it wasn't planned that they would actually go in the Range Rover with the Queen, but the Queen insisted. Like you said, because she didn't want to actually drive around on her own, which must have been amazing for your mum, though. I mean, I don't know if she ever mentioned or talked about what she might have talked about while she was in the Range Rover.
No, I think they were so stunned that they kind of, and you couldn't hear yourself think anyway because of all the noise, such that I think my mother sort of said something along the lines of, well, how about that then? Who was expecting that?
Oh wow.
The Hockey Museum has got the video of that because my boss at the time kindly agreed to record it on television. And the thing is, they weren't supposed to be covering that on television, but the racing got cancelled that day because it was so wet. So they decided to go over to Wembley and show the Queen going around the stadium. So that was sort of an unexpected bonus. And so I was very lucky that, as I say, my boss at the time was recording it for me, or we wouldn't have had that because everybody else who'd set their video recorders back in the day, you know, the timings were all wrong because they started half an hour earlier than they planned to.
I think one thing that which was different because she came round in the Range Rover is the moment she entered the stadium. Although we talk about the noise and the crescendo, it doubled in noise. Wow. It was just phenomenal, and I recall that distinctly. And you know, all the way around, it was just constant in terms of the spectators. Of course, most of them schoolgirls, but you know, that was fantastic in itself. And I believe, I don't know quite on this story, Chris, you might know that she's quite a stickler for time. And I think the moment she left lunch and taken around the stadium, I think they'd kind of mistimed it a little bit because it was very crowded and couldn't get the car there quickly enough. So I think she was slightly behind the time in terms of the lineup. Presentation and the start.
No, it was when she was arriving for them.
Right.
And apparently the Queen won't have the traffic held for her.
Okay.
So they thought they'd left enough time, and they hadn't. And she ended up arriving late. I don't think she was that late, but
okay.
she was late, and she was a bit on edge simply because they were late, and she doesn't like being late.
Absolutely, yeah.
And my mother said it wasn't until she'd introduced, I think, Miss Mitchell, and said something about, well, she's done 30 years, and Miss Mitchell said 40, and the Queen laughed, and you know, that kind of broke the ice. But I think one of my favourite memories of that, and I don't know whether Maggie will agree, was the thrill of singing God Save the Queen, being able to look at the Queen. That was a really special moment. And everybody turned to look at the Queen. That's what was so extraordinary.
But also, Chris, as well, was it not that when the match finished and the Queen left the seat, the crowd sang it again? And it was a special moment where, so it was actually sung twice on that occasion. And it was just, they all just started singing again at the end of the match as she was leaving and departing the stadium.
We were talking about the crowd, so here it is.
Wow.
Look at that.
It's only a small section. Only a small section of the crowd, and I'm not sure whether this is the picture from the royal visit or anything like that. But if this was anything like when the Queen visited, or even more so, it would have been amazing. I mean, you can see obviously a lot of the schoolgirls there. I see a couple of boys there as well, looks like, but mostly girls. But they've got like England flags and you know, the Union flag as well. But that, if that was anything like when you were playing, you know, there was a bigger runoff, wasn't there? Or a bigger gap between the pitch and also the where the crowd started. Did it actually seem that far away?
Quite honestly, Taff, the whole thing was so out of our normal experience of playing. I don't think we distinguished that. Remember, we normally played in front of a few hundred.
Yeah.
So the fact that there was this huge crowd and this wall of noise, I don't think we noticed the gap in between. The whole thing was surreal.
Chris, what about yourself? I mean, you did you obviously your mum being involved in you know, the organisational part of the games and things like that. You quite possibly, did you go with your mum, or did you go with like school visits and things like that? Or?
Well, in the early days, because Mum was kind of on duty, my father would drive us up, and we would have lunch in the car park. We had one of those special tickets, but we had to get there really early because there were so many coaches and things coming in. My father was never very good at waiting around, but you know, we would have hot soup and sandwiches, which my mother had made before she disappeared off at the crack of dawn. But then when I was at boarding school, I did go a couple of times from boarding school, and I would meet up with my mother, and she would give me some food, as happened with boarding schools. But in a way, it was nicer when it was sort of a family outing, because you know, it wasn't very often that we did things as a family together, and that was a really good opportunity for us to sort of all experience the same thing.
And coming on to like people being there, the very first game that was played, I think they had about 30,000, and that were over the years expanded to 68,000 to its maximum. And 68,000, I mean, even 30,000 or whatever, 68,000 is phenomenal. When you played the Queen's game, I think was 52,000 at the time.
I think the Queen's was 62, I think, was it? And I think, Anita, was your 68. Your last Wembley, you said, was 66?
Yeah, that was 76, and we had 68,000 there. I mean, if you think about it, I was just talking to my husband about it. There are hardly, you know, can you think of any other women's sport event that would have that number of people? Remember the stadium, that was the old Wembley Stadium before there were seats put in. So 68,000 is a pretty enormous number.
Saying about the you know, the amount of people, spectators that were there, there was actually a little bit of a note in one of the magazines that, or the programs that were actually sent out, which was a discipline note, saying that the crowd shouldn't make that much noise, and they shouldn't move around in their seats too much because it's distracting to the players. Now,
and that they couldn't hear the whistle, I think it was.
Yeah, that as well. Yeah, and to me, that's like crazy. We won't get that now.
I think my recollection of it is that they started cheering as soon as England got the ball.
Yeah.
And the nearer we got to the goal to score against the opponents, they got louder and louder and louder. Then if we got tackled or it was a 16-yard hit out, or, you know, possession was with the other team, they would go quiet again. It just went up and down like that all the time. Absolutely. And of course, because England had the ball most of the time, they were noisy most of the time.
I like it, yes.
But your record at the you know, at the Wembley Games is pretty impressive, isn't it? Because you know, I think you won more than 50% of the games whilst you were there. So you kind of played against some really, you know, good teams and beat them. You know, even like Australia and things like that. What was it like? You know, playing against teams like, you know, Germany, Netherlands, and whatever at Wembley.
Well, I think you've got to remember that in those times, England were ranked much higher in the world. Yeah. And so, I mean, actually, we didn't have a terribly good record when I was playing at Wembley. But having said that, you know, we were pretty much expected to win. And I'm just sorry we didn't always win, but it was a different order then.
Yeah.
You know, since then, there are a lot of other countries that have really come up and developed that. You know, hockey's developed massively in a whole lot of countries where it wasn't really played much at all when Maggie and I were playing.
But I think you also have to remember some of the teams that played at Wembley were actually touring teams. Like Australia and New Zealand and America, and therefore they bonded a lot more and knew their team probably better than the England team did, because they played a lot of matches. You know, they were over in Europe and they had a whole string of engagements.
To Jill Boone a little while ago, and she said, particularly when she was talking about the 2012 and the 2016 squads, that the England and Great Britain team was a team that terrified some players and scared teams. And they would, once they overcame that initial fright, really step their game up. And it was a really bit, like, you know, like in football, we talk about, you know, you get yourself psyched up for a big Premier League clash, and maybe a team can beat a top 4 Premier League team, but struggles against the mid-table and below. Do you feel like perhaps these nations, when they came over to play at Wembley, they were really stepping it up and feeling that this was a chance to really prove themselves and punch above their weight against sort of the giants of the game?
Yeah, I think that was true to some extent. And also remember that we'd had, you know, once you played at Wembley once, you then took that experience through to the next time and the next time. But for most of them, it was their first time, and it was easy to be overawed by the whole experience. So I think it was pretty tough for those teams coming to Wembley when they'd never played there before, most of them.
I mean, Australia was mentioned, the fact that they came over and maybe they were a touring side, but there's a bit of a caveat in that as well.
Yes, they didn't get to play at Wembley. This was in 1970. They did a pitch inspection on the Thursday, and it was obvious that the pitch wasn't going to be playable. So somehow they switched the whole venue to White City at 48 hours notice. Wow. And the poor Australian team, they hadn't realised how bad the traffic was going to be. And they ended up having to stop the police and say, look, we are the team. There's not going to be a match unless we get there. And so the police had to escort them, and they got a couple of, mounted police on horses to try and get them through the traffic. Otherwise, it wasn't going to be a match at all.
Yeah, that's crazy to, think that they were able to change the venue from, Wembley to White City in such a short time. And the capacity of the stadium was a little bit less, wasn't it, as well? Some people were obviously disappointed that they didn't get to see that game. We talked to we kind of like touched on the fans and how many people attended. Now I believe that there was times where fan mail got delivered to the changing rooms before the game. Did that ever happen in your time when you played? And did you ever respond to any? It's easier now that with Kate's on Instagram and Twitter and all that stuff, and engaging with her fans, and it's easier for athletes or role models to actually interact with the fan base. Do you ever interact with people that may have sent you fan mails and maybe wrote back to them, or meet them, or did autographs, or even do a victory lap? There is an image of you, I think, Maggie, in the book with a flag,
cap on and a flag. Yeah, that's right. I mean,
my wonderment is that where did you get that flag from, and did you ever return it to the spectator?
Absolutely not. I've still got the flag and the cap. We in the changing room, we certainly didn't have mobiles, but we got telegrams, so that tells you telegrams. These days you don't get a telegram, so we got cards, we had flowers delivered, so everything came through the little door and into the changing rooms. And often you'd find after we'd had lunch and we went back through the stadium down to the changing rooms to get change, they would be there, all there, so different. And then there would be some personal messages, I'm sure, and some team messages. So we all just, as Anita mentioned earlier, we very much read them out to everyone, in different ways. So it was all very special. In terms of whether we responded, I think it would be very different. Quite often, a lot of the things we got were from friends and family, occasional ones from people afar. Out on the pitch, yes, around the lap of honour, I think certainly on the Royal Wembley, the excitement was still there post-game. So anything I could grab or someone threw at me, then it got on my head, or the scarf around the neck, the flag in the air. So it was just taking it all in at the very end and celebrating with the crowd, because they'd been tremendous.
Was there any autographs? Did you sign any autographs or anything like that? Or?
I think occasionally, but it wasn't, we were just excited. So I suppose it was very different. Now, these days, you stand and you do all the autographs. But I think the more autographs you did, the less time you had to go around the whole stadium. So I think we were just trying to get around to see everybody because it was pretty vast. So yes, occasionally you'd stop, but not in the same way. The one thing you had to ensure that you didn't leave your stick lying around, or that certainly would be a souvenir for one of the schoolgirls. I do recall in my time that a stick did disappear, and you just had to make sure that your stick didn't disappear, in particular if you only had one.
Yeah.
In my early days, I probably had one stick that I always played with.
What about yourself, Anita? Did you do lap of honours and steal any flags like Maggie did and never return them?
No, well, we were much too well behaved for that. But actually, I saw that question. I thought, I don't think we did do a lap of honour, but Maggie might remember in those games that we played in together. I think that came in much later.
Yeah.
I certainly don't remember getting any fan mail or signing autographs.
No, it was
But
latterly.
as Maggie said, there was a tradition of flowers and telegrams, maybe from your club that you played for, etc. There were supporters, but they were people known to you rather than the kind of fan mail. And of course, there were no mobile phones, no social media, or any of that. So we weren't celebrities like Kate is.
I think originally that Wembley Stadium didn't want us to do the lap of honour, but you just got carried away in certain circumstances. So I think eventually it led to it being a little bit of a lap of honour. Yeah. And that could have been set off in the Royal Wembley when we got a bit excited.
Yeah, it's I think we felt a really big sense of responsibility to to thank the crowd, frankly, for coming to watch us and for supporting us. So I think we wanted to take that time, and there's also balancing up with making sure you got your ice bath and you did all that stuff as well. So it was definitely a balance, but we all felt that sense of responsibility and duty to want to do it. And although I remember I think the first time I signed an autograph, I think it was 1999, Maggie, when you were coaching at the Open. I was like, this is weird. Why am I signing this program? It's so odd. I was like, not 18 or 19. It's just the strangest thing. But then, it just became a thing that you do, and had to learn to take selfies and things like that. I didn't know how to take a selfie, but it was just so nice to just say thank you to the crowd, and particularly the youngsters that would stay a little bit longer to just see if they could meet you and say hello, and you could sign their flag, or that. I think that's just such a nice thing you can do to give back. And I was one of those,
at Wembley. Now I was one of those young ones, and I remember the team coming to do a lap of honour and seeing them coming round was it like a shale?
Yeah.
Yeah. And I just remember, I remember that so clearly. And so now it was then so important to give that back to the youngsters when I was playing, particularly Maggie and Anita's generation, particularly, and the ladies that I grew up playing with. Lots of them were PE teachers, and lots of them had lots of connections through clubs as well with lots of young people. And it's one of the, we call it the hockey family, but it is that for a reason, because there's always been that history of whether you think you're a role model or you're inspiring others or not, there is that natural way, just because of that contact with young people through sport or hockey specifically. And I think there's always been that sense of giving back. That's why it's been instilled in me. That's what you do. You then go, and I was playing at the Greater Manchester Games, so then when you get the opportunity to go back, you do it, because that's what Tina Cullen did before me, and Maggie Souyave did before Tina, and you just pass it down in that way.
So there were like match teas. Sometimes you had match teas before the game, and sometimes you had them after the game. So talk us through how formal it was, and what your experience was like.
Match teas, for what I remember, match teas were after the game. Okay, and then what was interesting is the longer you took going on a lap of honour and enjoying the atmosphere in the stadium, and then walking back down the tunnel to go into the changing rooms to get changed to go to tea. In our day, we certainly didn't have to put up with having ice baths, so maybe we had the quick shower. I mean, in Wembley you had individual showers, individual baths, and then the big communal one. And what I do remember is we all sort of just jumped in the communal one and had a play, and then out we got, and then got changed, put our blazers on, and into tea. And by the time you got to tea, if you'd been a little bit late, there was no tea left anyway, so it was just, but it didn't matter too much. And of course, when you actually got selected for England, you got complimentary tea tickets, so of course, you had to decide who out of your family and friends would get these tickets. So they were very special as well, very prized tickets. So into tea and enjoy to chat to everyone. You know, we mingled a little bit with our own families, and occasionally we would obviously speak with the opposition. It just depended the situation.
Yes, I do remember getting a tea ticket was sort of quite a big deal, and all the county associations could buy tickets. I mean, it was the banqueting hall, and there were just loads and loads of people there. My father always described it as the best bun fight in Europe, because you were lucky if you could actually get to the table and get any tea, because there were just so many people that descended on it. Yeah. And my father's best moment was when he approached the tea table and he saw another man there, and he said, "I think I should tell you that these sandwiches taste like cardboard." And then he introduced himself, and he was only talking to the managing director of Wembley, Jeffrey Nugas, who said to him, "Don't worry, I'm going to sort out the catering. You'd only just taken over as managing director."
Brilliant.
But yeah, so you know, it was hard work even for us that had just watched the match and then went down to the banqueting hall. You know, you were lucky if you got one sandwich, let alone, you know, a cup of tea or cake.
There were loads of people in the tea because it was a way of saying thank you to all the volunteers in hockey in the different clubs and counties. And so that it was absolutely jam-packed with the great and the good of hockey. Yeah. So you felt as a player coming in, as Maggie says, you were lucky if you got any tea, but that didn't really matter because it was just such a relief really to have got through it all and be able to see your family and friends again.
Yeah. That's right. And because we wore the distinctive blazer, the England blazer, then, and the opposition often had a blazer on as well, then as we mingled in there, it clearly showed who the players were. So I think people enjoyed that, so that you were identified rather than just mingled, you know, with your ordinary clothes. So I think the blazer sometimes has that significance as well.
I was just going to say, and then there was a formal dinner in the evening. Afterwards, particularly for those teams that you know, weren't the home countries, but even the home countries, they did have a dinner and everybody thanked each other and you know, told some funny stories. I've been cataloguing all my mother's speeches because she was president of the All England from 1976 to 1986, and she actually wrote all her speeches down. So I was going through and reading what she said, but I think it was one of those evenings where everybody was just so relieved that the match had happened, that they could actually relax and enjoy the evening. So I'd like to ask Anita and Maggie whether they actually enjoyed the dinners.
Well, I'll say, yeah, I did once I got the speech over.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I remember when I was captain, there were several of us in the team who were married, and we lobbied the England executive to allow husbands to go to this dinner because it had been an all-women's female affair. And I'm pretty sure during my time they did actually agree to allow male partners, husbands, I don't know what they were called then, to attend. And that was quite a breakthrough because previously that hadn't been allowed.
I think the thing about the speeches as well, if they were at the end of the dinner, you certainly didn't enjoy your dinner. So there was a lot to be said for occasionally having the speeches first and then being able to just relax. So if anything about being nervous, probably that is the occasion when you're nervous more so than playing out on the pitch.
Yeah. Very much different to when you played then, Kate.
I know, and I think it's something that I really wish we did have a little bit more of, because yes, you know, I think there's more interaction with players, partly because of social media, partly because of the various kind of commissions that athletes are on, or especially playing abroad and things like that. Players travel more and play with each other more in that sense, but you don't tend to have that same social or formal aspect anymore. I I'm trying to think that perhaps in the beginning of my career, I remember going to Australia with, again, Maggie, when Maggie was coach, and I think we went out with Australians a couple of times when we were out over there to have dinner, and we kind of sat with them and talked to them, and it's really nice to have that shared experience with people that are playing hockey in another country and talk about it. And I think I think there's something there that I think would be nice to bring back. I mean, I really want to bring back the blazer. I loved those blazers. I still love that. Yeah, I think it's just the most iconic, smart, sharp thing. And as Maggie said, when you wear it, you feel special, and you're, people can spot you and come and talk to you. I think it's a lovely thing.
Okay, with your playing days, there were social occasions after major tournaments, but I remember T-Ball Weissenborn turning up in playing kit at a nightclub. But there was no
kind of social occasion.
So that's kind of so there was no formal whatsoever.
No, not that I can recall. It's definitely been more about, I mean, particularly at the end of the tournament. I mean, it's because I suppose they're now less one-off games, where you can make a big event of it. There are, even if we're playing a team that comes over or we travel, you play 5 test games, and still I can't think even then there's anything kind of formal that ever gets done. And I do think we should bring that back. After tournaments, it's absolute carnage. After at Lee Valley, after the European Championships in 2015, we ended up in a casino with our playing kit still on. So it's still going strong. But a blazer would have looked much better, I think.
And I think at the Wembley dinners that you had the tables where you did have you didn't sit with your team, you mixed with the opposition. And again, that was important, not just from a player point of view, but from the officials and the people who were behind, the sort of organization of the game. So you did have that, because that's what it was all about, really. It wasn't just about yourselves. It was about, everything about what it was to host a game, really. I suppose the difference now is that there's so many games. When we played 3 home countries, 1 opposition game, and therefore to do 4 dinners, teas and dinners in that way was probably easier to organise in that respect. And
I think Maggie and Kate have hit on something there about values, because in the days certainly when we were playing and immediately before, the All England Women's Hockey Association didn't really support it being too competitive. The emphasis was not to be on winning as such. It was on the camaraderie and the social interaction and the taking part with people from different parts of the world. And so that was the emphasis. And they actually absolutely rejected making it too competitive and declaring winners of tournaments in some cases.
Again, you're talking about this, and it's taking me back to me actually being there when I wasn't even there. Anyway, how do you think we can possibly replicate it or do something similar? I know you touched on it and say we probably wouldn't be able to get something similar to going to Wembley, but could we do something similar? Could we and how do you think we should do that? How can we accomplish that, maybe?
This is the 70th year. What we're saying is that this is a celebration, isn't it?
Yeah.
Now, if COVID hadn't been on, we could have said to Wembley, right, can we host an international hockey match at Wembley? And yes, still host it on grass. So it's actually just celebrating the anniversary of Wembley. So, and then we watch our modern players play today on grass. You know what I mean? So we create a spectacle in that respect.
I personally think they will not be as skillful as you ever were.
No. 100%.
3D skills and things like that were.
And we give them our clothing, we give them a pinafore to wear, and so we create a spectacle.
Kate, can you imagine that the current players playing in the long sleeve, rugby type shirts and the long skirts? Can you imagine that? Can you imagine?
I mean, I wasn't that far off it. I started school in a rugby shirt and thick skirt. I know one of the England players and GB players went to train some of the actresses for this one of the St Trinian's films on grass, obviously. But obviously she's used to playing on AstroTurf, so she was like demonstrating skills, and she tried to just literally receive the ball, but she was like letting it come across the body, and it just kept hopping over a stick, and she's like, I'm an international, I'm supposed to be showing these actresses what to do. But it's a totally different game, different skills, and it would be amusing to see the modern day players playing on grass for sure, because I don't think they'd be able to. I think they'd go down so well.
Maybe for comic relief, we could have done something.
Yes.
So,
we need to make this happen. Maybe next year or something.
Comic relief is a good shout. Yeah, sport relief.
you know, even if it's just for a moment in time, they will recreate that.
Yeah, it's a good idea.
There's no reason why we can't go back to Wembley. So it's whether with the finance and whether we've got the inclination.
Yeah. Maggie,
I think that's the thing about trying to recreate it. It was also the going to Wembley, and particularly with the old stadium, I think it had so much history, and you know, just the towers. It was so iconic. And yes, we have Wembley, and it is special, but it's not
the same.
Not the same. And maybe for this next, for the younger generation, perhaps it is the same for them. Perhaps they feel about the new Wembley as we do feel about the old Wembley. So I do think the venue is part of it. So I think the Stoop was amazing, and I agree, if we go somewhere you have to fill it out, otherwise it just doesn't work for anybody. But I think the venue is really important. So if we can find, I think stepping stone in it is a good idea, and finding the right venues that people want to just have a day out and go there because it's special and get to see wonderful international hockey being played. That would be awesome.
I really, maybe on the 75th anniversary, get the Rio squad to play against the current.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wow.
5 years' time.
I will be wanting to play in a Pinafore in that many years.
Well, Kate, you'd love that blazer anyway, so
I'm sold.
Let's talk about it. Well, on that note, ladies, I'd like to thank you. I mean, we've gone through a lot today, and it's amazing that when the stories that you've actually come out with and things like that, and it's amazing. It's been amazing having you on the podcast, this special podcast that we did. I really don't know what to say. You're all legends, every single one of you. And I just want to thank you very much for joining us for this very special edition of Talk Hockey Radio. Chris, they can actually buy the book, can't they? From
got it here.
Oh, you got it there. Oh,
yeah, definitely. That's the
there it is.
Yeah, definitely.
The Magic of Wembley, it's available on the Hockey Museum's website.
And order your book. It's not expensive. I think, what is it, £10, £12 or something like that?
The idea of capturing the memories and giving everybody a chance to say, oh, do you remember that? Or people going, oh, wow, I can't believe there were that many people there.